Welcome to the Ellevate podcast, conversations with women changing the face of business. And now your hosts, Kristy, Wallace, and Maricella, Herrera.
Hello and welcome to the Ellevate podcast. This is your host, Kristy Wallace, with my co-host, Maricella Herrera. Hi, Maricella. How's it going today?
Hey, Kristy. It's going well. Yeah, chugging along.
Well, I'm actually really energized today. We have been doing some great events at Ellevate Network, our Raise Her Voice events. Many of you listeners may have heard us talk about it on a previous podcast, but it was an opportunity for us to give a platform and amplification to women in the workplace, women who work alongside of you every day, to share their experiences, to really humanize so much of what it means to be a woman in the workplace. And through those stories to build allyship, advocates, awareness, and more. So we've had a number of these events throughout the globe. And coming off of all of that, it's just been a really amazing experience.
Yeah, I mean, listening to some of the stories, they're incredible, right? Like, it's so good to hear what other people have gone through, know you're not alone, and so inspiring.
Yeah, we at Ellevate, we believe a lot in the power of story, and our guest today does too. Cassandra Rae Pittman, she and I actually met, she was moderating a panel I was on a couple of months ago, and then I was on her podcast, which was a lot of fun, and invited her on to the Ellevate podcast. And she talks so much about the power of storytelling as well, particularly as it pertains to power. Who has power, who doesn't, the benefits of power, and how that also translates to political power and to creating impact and change. As she is full of stories and insights, and a American who moved to the UK and got actively involved in their political system to support her community and to create the world in which she seeks.
I love this. I really am curious to hear her story and hear, as an immigrant, going into a different country, how she was able to get into making a difference as myself, an immigrant. I always think about that too, like how can you get more involved in the place where you live to make a difference in your community. But also, as you were talking about power, it made me think of our upcoming Mobilize Women Week, which will be hosted the week of June 21st. For all of you who have heard the podcast, you probably know that Mobilize Women is one of our initiatives that's very near and dear to my heart. We're doing a summit in person in New York City for the last, few years. This is our 5th year doing Mobilize Women. And this year, because of, the pandemic, same as last year, we will be doing it online throughout a week. So a week of experiences and discussions with incredible people who have different takes on what we can do to build a better world, to really change the culture in business, to really create change in society. And one of the panels that I'm the most excited about is one on power dynamics and equity. And, we're still confirming our speakers for that, but it's going to be great. I'm not gonna share the names that we are in talks with because I don't want to jinx it, but it's gonna be quite the session. So go check out Mobilize Women on the Ellevate website and sign up.
Yes, Maricella, I know if you are involved, which you are, in driving the content and vision for Mobilize Women, that it is sure to be a cannot miss event. And I can't wait for it. And I encourage all of our listeners to join us in June to mobilize, to create change, to learn, to connect, and to grow. We will see you there. And let's get to my conversation with Cassandra. Cassandra, thank you so much for joining us today on the Ellevate podcast.
Thanks for having me, Kristy. I'm delighted to be here.
You and I met a little bit ago. We were on a panel together. You were the amazing moderator. And since then,
Thanks.
I love moderators. I think it's so much about the storytelling and how you're connecting all the different voices to tell the strongest message around that theme. And so you were a master moderator.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. It was a lot of fun. I mean, this is such a weird year. We've all had to skill up really quickly, I think, in digital conferencing. So making that connection is a little bit more of a challenge over Zoom, but we try our best.
What is your stance on digital events and thought leadership?
I think probably like a lot of people, I'm in two minds. In one way, I love how accessible it is making content. You and I both have small children, and it's hard to make time in your life to do all of this in-person networking and just the traveling to and from, and things can be in other cities, and there's a whole other cost for that. And so being able to carve out 30 minutes, an hour and a half and sit in front of your computer is a lot more doable. And that's the positive. But I think we are kidding ourselves if we think the same depth and quality of connection is happening online. And so I hope what happens going forward, once we are over this weird dark period in time, is that we're able to really have a hybrid in a lot of these things, and use digital for the expansiveness that it has to offer, but also make sure that we're having enough in-person touch points. But what do you think of it, Kristy, actually? Because you're having to run a lot of digital content now.
Yeah, I would say I agree with you on the accessibility. Especially for me, I've really, so Ellevate, we have communities all over the world, and I used to travel quite a bit to go to different conferences and to visit our communities. And then now I've found in the past year that I can be in NC Triangle at 2, and then in Toronto at 3, and London at 5, and just jump around and meet a bunch of people and engage in conversations. And that's been really meaningful to me, and I think to our community around making those deeper connections. And I would say when it comes to really building a network or building those touch points, what's important is we just have to think about it differently. We're not going to connect in the same way. If you're at a big conference, for example, and maybe you're talking to people at the networking event and talking to the people who sit around you and connecting with the speakers afterwards, that's different in this virtual space. And it doesn't mean that it's unattainable. It means we have to do things differently. And for us at Ellevate, it's been much more about these curated, smaller conversations, really ensuring that, you are building those relationships in an ongoing basis. For example, I lead our executive roundtable every single week, and it's expert led. You're learning something, but you always end up in a breakout room with 3 to 4 peers working through the topic together, building relationships. So I would say that, yes, we're hungry for in person and the way that things were, but now and into the future is an opportunity to envision it in a different way. And how do you maybe approach these touch points from a place of disruption, and how can we do it differently?
Yeah, I love that. I love that you've tweaked the design. I feel like maybe what's happened quite a bit over the last year and a bit is that we've just taken what would have happened in person and thrown it online. And maybe that's where I'm feeling when I'm attending some of this stuff, sometimes a little bit of a lack of a connection. But what you've just described is a really deliberate design of how to make digital work. And hopefully we'll see more of that too.
Yeah. Cassandra, I want to introduce you a little bit more to our audience. Can you share a bit about who you are and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, so I grew up mostly in California, a little bit in Florida, but I had kind of a interesting, turbulent, rocky childhood. My father was an engineer for an oil company, and he did quite well. But my mother's side of the family was quite poor, really. Lots of alcoholism and drug addiction in that family, and I kind of bounced between the two. And I think that gave me a really unique perspective on, what was possible in life, but also how difficult it is for people who don't have resources that most of us take for granted, basic education, networks, money, to really break through. And so I think my entire life I've been sort of driven by this desire to just make the absolute most out of my life it can possibly be, and have lots of adventures, and I've moved abroad and I've lived in lots of different countries, but also to make sure that I'm using some of my skills and talents to help platform opportunities for other people. And so that's sort of what I've done in various ways. I live in the UK now. I have a podcast, which is, I know it was something that you and I connected about, and I've had a career that spanned business. I've been a management consultant and also higher education, working for a number of European business schools. So I've been involved in lots of different things. And throughout all of that, since I was about 17, I've also been involved in politics and in various ways as volunteers on a campaign, working for some campaigns. So I've been involved in lots of different things, but I think the central underlying thing I've been trying to do with my life is really help people become what they can be in this little life that we have.
Cassandra, I love that you talk so much about your purpose. And when I hear you say those words, and then also talking about education, you're talking about politics, you're talking about this world experience and view, I'm very intrigued, because I see connections between all of that, access to education, higher education, political advocacy. We're in a time where, from employees to business leaders to politicians to citizens and voters, we are becoming louder in using our voice for change. We are banding together. We're really, being more informed. And so it's exciting to hear your story. And I'm curious, like, can you share more about what, those areas of your life and your passion and your work, how you see that coming together, and what are the ways in which that can create that change that you seek?
Yeah. So I spend a lot of my time, I mean, I know that this is not what a normal person does, but I spend a lot of my time and have spent a lot of my time thinking about power and about access to power and about what power means. And I think that a lot of people have an idea about power that is, power means to have power over something. It means dominance. And I really think it means influence, and being able to influence the world or your own life, or, the lives of other people in a positive way that you want to see. And because I think of it in this unified way, all of those areas that we've talked about, whether it's political advocacy or, business or access to capital or working through nonprofits, to me, that's all a way to influence the world in a positive way, hopefully in a positive way. And so that's why I've never seen those divisions. And it's always been a little bit strange to me that people do. But I have a hypothesis that we, a lot of us, are cutting ourselves off from a lot of the influence we could have by sort of pigeonholing. And I do see that in this time, those barriers are breaking down, and in a lot of ways that's good. And we, like you said, we have companies are now involved in political debates, and people are, I think the role of the citizen is being redefined right now, and that's really exciting. But it's also leading to some teething problems. We have to find ways to be in business and be friends with people who don't see the world the same way that we do, and might be from different political persuasions. And so it's a lot to unpack. But I think if you really want to use your life in the most optimal and impactful way, you really have to say, how can I influence in all of these things and all of these ways that I care about?
I wonder if you have advice for our listeners, because many of us, you said we're teething, and I agree. We're struggling with how and where to speak up.
Mm,
And I know, there's been a lot of conversations about that within your family or
mm,
on social
mhm,
media, but also within the workplace.
yeah,
We live in a time where for too long did we leave our identities at the door. And now I mean, literally people are seeing within our homes, and we're in the US a time of great transformation where we're talking not only about politics and our political landscape, but about who benefits and who doesn't from a lot of these decisions. We're talking about the racism in our
mm,
country, around the classism and socioeconomic, and there's just a multitude of issues, from environment to capitalism, that are coming into the workplace, and
mm.
being able to have those conversations is something I think we're not very well versed at. Do you have advice on how to approach that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you have absolutely hit the nail on the head. Nobody trained us to have these conversations, right? I mean, how many times have you heard you don't talk politics, you don't talk religion, you don't talk money? But actually, politics, religion, and money, you know, influence everybody's lives. So, and right now we're at this, point in time where there is this lack of a delineation. We live a lot of our lives on social media, and so it's just it's just not realistic to think we're going to live in these silos anymore. So I think my advice is it's not important to be right. It's important to understand and to be understood. So I think where a lot of this breaks down is that you get into a conversation with somebody, particularly about politics, or about very sensitive, very meaningful conversations about race and racism and things that we're trying to solve. And we get in defensive postures because we want to be right. I do it too. Everybody does it, right? I mean, we all want to be right so badly, and we want people to tell us that we're right. And you're never going to convince anybody that you're right by telling them how wrong they are. So for me, it's so important that we have these conversations, but in order to have productive conversations, you have to lead with empathy and you have to lead with respect. And I think you have to lead looking for some common ground, because that's how you start to build on consensus and you build points of agreement. And that is a really hard thing to do because we're not practiced at it. We don't make friends with people who see the world differently than we do very much, because we like to hang out with people who more or less see the world like us. And our families, by and large, maybe not so much in the last 4 or 8 years, but prior to that, I think most of us, by and large, you're in groups of people who have had your similar set of experiences and see the world like you do. And so it takes some practice and it takes some grace. So that's the other thing, is I would say extend grace to somebody else, but also extend grace to yourself if you don't get it absolutely right the first time. Try to be humble but confident in what you believe, and seek out those opportunities to speak with people that do have a different perspective on things. And I would also say this, for me, there's a difference between seeking out conversations with people who have a different perspective, who might align differently on a political spectrum or see the world in a kind of in a different way than I do, and really reaching out to what I call baddies. And it's a question that I've had to ask myself a lot in the podcast, in my own podcast, because I really do try to have a really wide variety of opinions represented, and women from all walks of life. And I say, but I'm not going to platform baddies. So while I definitely am interested to talking to people who might be on the other side of the political spectrum than I am, what I'm not interested in doing is having a long, drawn out conversation with a racist. And so I think there's also a little bit of a delicate balance there.
And you talk about, you mentioned your podcast. You have a great podcast. Everyone should check it out. Tell it like it is. Women Talk Money, Power, and Sex. And, I believe that a big part of any type of, leadership, if it's within your workplace, your community, creating, a podcast and content, is doing the work first. I mean, there is an onus on all of us to understand what we're talking about, to put in the work. to educate ourselves and then to listen and to actively listen. And that's a skill that I've certainly honed through the podcast. But are there ways in which you push yourself to, continue learning, or ways in which you approach the speakers on your podcast to ensure that you're expanding your mind and your perspective?
Well, the podcast is kind of like the shortcut for me to do that, because I get to invite, people that I'm interested in talking to, but it's my way of being like, well, I could never invite them to dinner, but I can invite them to a podcast. And I appreciate that not everybody has that opportunity or wants to have that opportunity. Not everyone wants to interview people on podcasts or in any other way. But I would also say this is where we can turn social media on its head if we want to. So, what YouTube and Facebook and Twitter are really good at is showing us content from people who have said things exactly like we've said, who think exactly like we do, who are going to have the same opinions that we're going to have. But you can also use social media to approach people in different groups, to join different groups, to understand different things, and to pose questions first. And I do that a little bit with politics. I'm a member of a Facebook group, and I honestly rarely recommend Facebook for anything, but a good friend of mine invited me to this group and said, I think you get a lot out of it. And it's a group that is specifically composed of people who are not involved in politics, quote unquote, per se, like not, working for a party or what have you, but are engaged in politics as just citizens and have different opinions. And I go to that group and ask questions to check myself a lot, because we don't know what we don't know. And I do know that I don't have the time. I mean, who's got the time to like read 4 different newspapers and watch 3 different news channels and, educate yourself on that way? Like I don't have that time, and neither does anybody else. So if I'm honest, I don't watch Fox News. I read the New York Times and I read The Economist. Those are the main 2 things I read. They're, center left things. Like that's the kind of news and the kind of opinions that I'm mostly taking in. And so to check myself on that, I will go to that group and I will ask questions of that group. And if you are lucky enough to work with people or have other networks in real life, particularly post-pandemic, that you can see, I think you can replicate that in real life. And if you do it with questions first, like, is there something I'm not seeing here? This is what this reads like to me. What's your view on that? It's surprising what you'll learn a lot of times.
You talk about politics, and I think it's fascinating that you sort of grew up in the US and now you're in the UK. Of course, there's been so much happening within the UK with Brexit and everything else over the past couple of years. And, I'm curious, what, do you have political aspirations? And, was it a learning curve, getting more involved in the political spectrum in a new environment?
Yes. So I absolutely do not have political aspirations. That would be the worst job for me. So this is part of what I think is wrong with politics these days. It's so theatrical. And actually what makes a really good politician is a boring bureaucrat. Like politics really should be about getting our schools to run, our roads to run. I mean, just, infrastructure and defense stuff that is just boring to most of us. That's actually what politics should be, the day-to-day of it, right? And instead it's become like incredibly dramatic and theatrical, which I don't necessarily think is a good thing. So I would not be a very good bureaucrat. I'm not great at details. I like to explore lots of new things. I'm really really good at like starting companies, not great at running them after a number of years. So that wouldn't be the job for me. But I do think that we have to I think I want to be involved in the things that affect my life. And so that's why I've gotten into politics, and because I see it as a way that can really create positive change. And it has been a learning curve to get involved in politics here. And I didn't get involved in any kind of party politics until after the Brexit vote in the UK. So I actually did my first master's degree was in European integration and development. And so I'm, for lots of reasons, a very strong supporter in the project of the European Union. And I was really brokenhearted when the Brexit vote happened and we voted to leave. And I just thought at that point, I can't stand on the sidelines, and I need to. And this is where I'm living now. This is my home right now. And now, of course, I have a British son who's starting to talk with a British accent, which is so weird. It's like so strange. But yeah, I just didn't want to sit on the sidelines anymore. And so I started to get involved in the last election, just a little bit, just supporting a local candidate who had lost his what they call the whip here, which essentially means the party threw him out because he voted against the party when it came to Brexit. And I thought, if we don't reward politicians who are willing to risk their career, and he knew that his career is probably over, his political career was probably over by doing that, then we're never going to have any, right, that are that principled. And so I decided to canvass for him, and through that got involved in the Liberal Democrats here, which is sort of like our centrist third party, something like in between. Well, honestly, the platform is very similar to what the Democratic Party is, but in a European context, that would be considered centrist. And then now on the executive team, local executive team for them. So it's definitely a learning curve. It's a different process. There's lots of different rules. It's we vote in a different way, but it's essentially the same thing, which is voting, trying to get people to vote for a person that you think is going to best represent the interests of that community.
Do you have advice for our listeners who want to get more involved on a political spectrum? And that can just be, calling your representative or getting engaged on a local level. But, in the US, we've been fighting for voting rights for some time. I was just doing a project with my second grader talking about women's right to vote. Her mind was blown that men could vote so far before women, and then we've certainly seen in terms of our Black and brown populations the impact of voter suppression and lack of access to voting that has hurt us. And I'm encouraged by this wave of just engagement and activism for having a voice and for creating change. I grew up in a household where you didn't talk about politics. It was rude to ask if someone voted for. I didn't know. I mean, to be honest with, I was a grown adult, and the elections were happening, and I was still like, I don't really understand, what the issues are or who's running. And I have worked hard to change that, and for myself and for my children. But long-winded way of asking, advice you have for our community and in ways that we can kind of show up every day in the political process. And I believe that regardless of where you stand on the issues or which parties you support, being engaged in that conversation is being engaged in your rights and, access to the services and, policies that impact you. So I would love to hear any advice you might have for our community on that.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing I would say is we desperately, desperately need more women in politics. So for your community, you just said, do I have political aspirations? And I don't, but anybody else should have, and so if you're inclined to think about that, or if you think, even if it's just a passing thought, I would say deep dive into that and see if it's something that you can explore at some point. I mean, we need more women in every elected office, not just in national politics, but really in local office as well. We are incredibly, incredibly underrepresented. So that's the first thing I'm going to say. The second thing I would say is decide if you want to be involved in party politics or issue politics or both, but they are different. And each can have its own frustrations. And I've had a little bit of experience volunteering and working in both. I mean, in another life, many years ago, I briefly worked for the Democratic Party, and then have done lots of volunteering on issue campaigns, and then some I did a brief amount of volunteering for the Obama campaign and then some campaigns here as well. So I would say, you know, the 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 frustrations with working with an issue-based politics is that you are very committed to that particular issue, even if sometimes if you're looking at the bigger picture and you can see, in this context, you don't have a lot of room for nuance and context in those issue-based politics. But the frustration working with party politics is that, that how parties work, and politics is the art of compromise. And so you might be working for a candidate or for, an election. You think, well, I like 80% of this, but not 100% of it. And that's part of it too. But no matter what you do, you can get involved today. You just literally send an email. that is as simple as it is. And I've had a lot of people ask me, now I'm on this executive team, and people say, like, how have you gone from 6 months to not being a member of a UK political party to now you're on the executive team of the local party? And I'm like, just because I didn't even send an email. I sent a tweet, Kristy. I sent a tweet and I said, I want to help out. Do you need some help? And they said, come on down and please help us send some leaflets. And that's how it started. And so I think it can move quite quickly if you're interested. They always need people. And the other thing I would say is, if you are even a little bit politically minded, I really recommend canvassing at least at one time in your life. So canvassing is when you go essentially knock door to door. And again, in the non-pandemic times, you knock door to door and you talk to people about your candidate. And the reason I recommend this is that it is an incredibly humbling and skill building experience. I mean, even just for your own, how you're going to grow as a professional, as a person. I mean, I am 40 years old. I have, been at very senior levels in positions in my jobs, and I'm kind of used to being somebody that people want to talk to. And it is an incredibly humbling experience to knock at somebody's door around dinner time when they don't want to talk politics and ask them to talk about your candidate. And I think it's just a very character building experience, and it really does help sharpen those communication skills.
Thank you for sharing that. Of course, when I was, probably not an appropriate story, but I was thinking back to my formative years when I had a brief stint selling knives door to door with my sister in the summer, and that was also very humbling, but for a much less important reason or cause.
But I imagine it would be for the exact same. I mean, it's the exact same skill set you need, and I just think it's so important to have experiences like that. Actually,
yeah, I mean it is. I agree, but it's also. I mean, we were talking earlier just about exposure to different ideas and to different voices and ideologies, and that's an important one too, to really understand kind of your neighbors or the people who live alongside of you,
yes.
and their perspective and their stance. And we also talked about political engagement, and canvassing is a way to engage others in that dialogue. And it's often said, tying it to allies and allyship a little bit, that many men, for example, have said, that they aren't active in the dialogue for gender equality because they kind of feel like they want to be invited to the conversation, and versus just steamrolling in or jumping in. Like, there's this aspect of, you feel like you should be invited to that place. And for anyone listening, I would encourage you to be an active ally. You don't need to be invited. Stand up for other people. Do that work.
I would also say, just to build on that, Kristy, like, you rarely have to be invited to listen. You might have to be invited to speak sometimes, but you rarely have to be invited to listen. And I recall I was in the UK when George Floyd was murdered. But like a lot of people, I was deeply, deeply, deeply affected by his murder and by, I'd of course been aware of Black Lives Matter before and supportive of it before, but it got to it came to a new level after that. And it was it was deeply affecting. And even as somebody who had felt like, if you had asked me before that happened, I would have been like, of course I support Black Lives Matter. I would have felt like very much on the right side of that. But this period in time, starting then and is still in this process now, really made me think I need to listen a whole lot more, and I need to reflect on the ways that I maybe haven't been as much a part of the solution as I should have been, and the ways that I need to understand the depth of this problem and deeply understand the ways that I can positively contribute to its solution. And nobody had to invite me to that party, but I had to invite myself to listen and to understand more deeply. And that is the very least that any one of us can do.
I agree. I absolutely agree. So go out there and canvas, listen to your community, get involved in just being that active listener. I want to ask you a couple more questions here. I know you mentioned you have a son, and I'm curious if you have any tips or insights to share with our community around parenting during a pandemic. There's been, such conversation around the impact on women in lost jobs, in many women leaving the workplace to just due to trying to keep their family safe and to keep their children educated. There's a lot of unbalanced burden placed on women, but I think there's also such resilience, there's such innovation, and I want to share if you have any tips on what has worked for you.
Well, first I want to say that the cards are stacked heavily in my favor in ways that most women, or maybe I shouldn't say most, but a lot of women, they are not. So I only have one. That's the first thing. He's 2.5 as opposed to in school age. So through most of the pandemic, he has been able to go to nursery. They closed nurseries at first in the UK, but then they opened them in September. And so he has been in nursery the entire time. My husband in a I don't know, a situation where we were able to see the silver lining. His business essentially collapsed overnight with when the pandemic happened, and so he has been able to be the primary person at home looking after Leo, which has been incredibly helpful. And so those things are not things that that every mother, every parent has had to deal with. So I know that. That said, there is a reality. So even though, for example, my husband is home, the truth is if mommy's home, most of the time Leo wants his mommy. And so the idea of having uninterrupted time, lots of uninterrupted time to work, extended periods of time, hasn't always been the case. It's essentially my working day has been shortened from 9 to 3, the days, the times that he's at nursery. And then after 3, I try not to schedule calls, and I send a few emails, but I can't really get a lot of proactive work done. And I've had to give myself that grace and be very honest with clients and the people I'm working with that those are the boundaries that I can work to. I'm also very lucky. I have a very strong value and need for autonomy in my life. And so the way I have crafted my career is such that I have a really just abnormal amount of autonomy in my roles. And so I've been able to set those boundaries in ways that other people haven't. But even with that, it was very difficult for me too, because I'm somebody who likes to do a lot of things and who likes to say yes to a lot of things and who doesn't like to let people down. And so that has been a learning process for me. The other thing that I have had to do is just embrace Disney Plus. So, when Leo was first born, I thought we were going to be some of these parents who were like didn't allow TV or very really limited TV, and that has all gone out the window. And I have just had to say, if you want to watch Frozen for the 4th time today, that is okay.
Yep. Yeah, I'm similar as my one kid is sitting outside the door on YouTube, I think. But that's, yeah, I mean, you've mentioned the word grace a few times in this conversation, and it's a word that I've really embodied a lot this year, because I've realized that, yeah, we just have to give ourselves some grace, our families a little bit of grace. I mean, we're living in unprecedented times, and that calls for us to, we started this conversation talking about networking differently and looking at events differently and looking at so many of these structures and systems through a new lens. And how do you, go from there? But if we're constantly holding ourselves to, rules or practices that maybe worked, although you could question if they worked, pre-pandemic, certainly I think that's, we need to just open our minds to a different way of looking at things and doing things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's a learning curve as well, to know that you have to give yourself that grace and also extend that grace to everybody else, because
Yep.
it is very, and it's not always just about having kids. I want to say this as well. Definitely managing a family in this time, in any time, but definitely in this time, and a successful career is a challenge. But I also want to make sure that people understand that if you don't have kids, it is totally okay to be overwhelmed with anxiety and stress and concern, and still not be able to be as productive as you once were. And you still also need to extend yourself that grace, because this has been a challenging time for people in every circumstance.
Yes. Thank you for saying that. And that is very true. I have a couple more questions for you to get to know you a little bit better. And we're going to do a quick lightning round. I'm going to ask you some questions. Just answer in, a couple words, a sentence. Are you an introvert or an extrovert?
I am like all the way extroverted. Like on the Myers-Briggs, it's like I don't even have like a % introvert in me. I am all the way extrovert.
What's your favorite day of the week?
Sunday.
Are you an early bird or a night owl?
Early bird. My
Who
friends
would
make
be-
fun of me because I can like fall asleep at like 9 o'clock at night. And I
so
have since I was like 25. It's like not an old thing.
yeah, yeah, I can't stay up late. Although during the pandemic, I've been staying up much later because that's with my son and I have been binge watching, you know,
Oh my
The
God, what are you
Office
watching?
and
Yeah, okay.
30 Rock and, all of that together. It's kind of our alone time together. So I've been staying up later, certainly. Who would be your dream dinner guest?
This is a tough one because I love to talk to people, and there are so many people. Alive or dead, or I can be either one.
Either.
I think in this moment of time, the person I would really, really love to talk to is Nicola Sturgeon. Do you know her?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, for your listeners, she's the First Minister of Scotland. And just in this little time that I have lived in the UK and been paying attention to things here, she is just an incredible communicator. And the thing that I'm always really impressed with is she's the leader of a party called the Scottish National Party. And I don't really agree with them on a lot of things. I mean, I agree with some, but if I look at their platform, I'm like, well, that's not the party for me. But whenever she talks, I think, whoa, that's so reasonable. How could I not support that? I mean, she's just incredible. And she's really driven a lot of progress in Scotland, and she may well be responsible for Scottish independence. I mean, we're going to see what happens in these next few years as Brexit unfolds. But I would love to have dinner with her. I'd love to have her on the podcast if she's listening. Please come on my podcast.
That's excellent. Do you have a pet peeve?
It really, really bothers me when people are rude to anybody in the service industry. If somebody's a little bit rude to a waitress or a waiter, or somebody, when they're ordering their coffee, it really bothers me.
Yeah. As a former service industry worker, I would agree.
Yeah.
People can be quite rude.
I think
But
it's like it shows somebody's character, how And I'm not talking about the odd day when you've just had a really bad day, because we can all be nasty to people, to anybody, right? And like a really, really bad day, and we can be regretful about that. But I just mean people who like are just in general a bit rude. I think it really shows their character. I won't do like I like to, if I'm interviewing somebody for a job, for example, I like to take them to lunch like in the after times. It's one of
Mhm.
my like tests. I like to see how they interact with that way, because I won't work with somebody um, who doesn't show that kind of respect to people who are in the service industry.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Thank you for saying that. Do you have a morning staple, something you do or eat, drink?
I mean, okay, it's got to be coffee, but I have a new one. I have a new one, and it is Beat Saber on the Oculus Quest 2. Have you discovered the Oculus Quest 2 yet?
So we have an Oculus, and but I haven't done. I personally haven't done much with it because I'm afraid of roller coasters, and my family keeps trying to trick me into going on a roller coaster on the Oculus. So I personally have not. I'm staying away from it. But please describe what you're talking about.
Okay. I feel like the world is made up of two kinds of people: people who like to exercise and people who do not like to exercise. And I am definitely in the do not like to exercise camp. I know I need to exercise. I try to exercise, on a fairly regular basis, but I just don't like it. And I have tried everything to like it. I've tried personal trainers, I've tried running, I've tried sports. Like I just don't really like it. I'm always just like counting down the time. And for the last, I don't know how long, 6 months or so, my husband has been dropping not so subtle hints that for his birthday, Father's Day, Christmas, what he wants is this VR headset. And I was thinking VR headset, I'm thinking it's going to be like gun games, like violent games. And I was like, we don't need that in our house. You're never going to play it. And if you do play it, we're going to lose you to this VR headset. Like, I'm not getting this VR headset. But anyway, this last Valentine's Day, I finally acquiesced and got it for him as a gift. And since we got it, I have been the one playing it all the time. And the game that I play, you got to try it, Kristy, is Beat Saber. And it sounds so stupid, but it's so much fun. You have sabers in your hand, like from Star Wars, and they send blocks at you and you have to hit the blocks. Oh my god, I'm laughing because it sounds so stupid, but you have to hit the blocks to the sound of like this really motivating music. And I don't know what they do, but it's a workout. It's like a real workout. It would be like, I don't know, the equivalent of taking a really brisk walk, excuse me, or maybe a light run, which is good enough for me, and doing some arm workout. And an hour can go on that thing, and I don't even notice that the time is passing, and I have so much fun. So I try, particularly early in the week on a Monday, specifically because that's what sets up the whole day too, to do at least 30 minutes now on the Oculus Quest 2 playing Beat Saber.
All right, I'm gonna have to try that out.
If you do, send me a friend request, and then we can play
Okay.
together.
Okay, I will totally do that. Yeah, and we initially got it because my son plays baseball, and it's supposed to be really good for like practicing baseball too. So virtual reality and fitness, we're gonna start the trend. Well, the trend has probably already started, but I'll jump on it.
Yeah, exactly. I think we're a little late to the party, but back
Yeah.
to what we were saying at the beginning about these ways to be engaged in a virtual format and to give your full attention, because it is so hard to not, also be checking your phone or what have you. I think that virtual reality is going to have a really big part to play in that, because if we
Mhm.
had, for example, a networking event through VR, I mean, you are completely engrossed. I think yeah, I really am kind of excited about its potential.
Yeah, and it is. Me too. This is gonna be. I don't know. I was speaking at an event the other day, and I was saying about how you're talking more about strategic visioning and the future, and you think about how much has changed in the last 15, 20 years. When I started my career, I was faxing resumes and didn't have a cell phone and had this like giant computer that I could only access if I was sitting at my desk. And now can work from anywhere and communicate with people via all these different platforms. And the world has changed so much. And so when you look to the future, it's pretty exciting to think that, where we may be 20 years further down the road.
Yeah. But it's one of the reasons it's all the more important to make sure that everybody has access to that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, at the moment, I feel like, if you do not have a really fast internet connection,
Yeah.
it's almost like not having a basic utility. So that's something we really need to make sure that everybody has.
Yes, absolutely true. All right, Cassandra, it has been an absolute pleasure catching up with you on the podcast today. Do you have any final thoughts you want to leave with our listeners?
I think we just said everything, and I don't have anything new to say, Kristy. I'm on the spot. I don't have anything new to add.
Why don't you share with our listeners how they can connect with you?
So you can find me on Twitter. I don't have a very good, I was very, very, very late to Twitter because who needed one more platform? But then eventually you had to be on Twitter. So my handle is @_badasscass_. Find me on Twitter, and I'm pretty much the same handle on any of the socials. And that's the best way to find me.
Excellent. Well, thanks for joining us today on the Ellevate podcast, and looking forward to connecting again soon.
Yes, likewise. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for listening to Ellevate. If you like what you hear, help a girl out. Subscribe to the Ellevate podcast on iTunes, give us 5 stars, and share your review. Also, don't forget to follow us on Twitter @EllevateNTWK, that's Ellevate Network, and become a member. You can learn all about membership and all the great things that Ellevate Network is doing at our website, www.ellevatenetwork.com. That's ELLEVATE network.com. And special thanks to our producer, Catherine Heller. She rocks. And to our voiceover artist, Rachel Griesinger. Thanks so much, and join us next week.
92% of households that start the year with Peloton are still active a year later.
92% because of a bike?
Not just bikes. We also make treadmills and rowers.
Oh, let me guess, for elite athletes only, right?
Nope. It doesn't matter if you're an avid exerciser or new to working out. Peloton can help you achieve your fitness goals. 92% stick with it. So can you. Try Peloton bikes, tread, or row risk-free with a 30-day home trial. New members only. Not available in remote locations. See additional terms at onepeloton.com/home-trial.